So it's really good to be here tonight and to talk with all of you. So the first thing I'll start with is just have each of you introduce your work in the exhibit as a series, and then discuss where your work originated for this show. So I'll have Bob go first.
Well, hi there. I think it might be useful to go back 15 years to look at my installations and how they've evolved before we start talking about the work in the exhibition. My work has always been about our relationship with the land, and whether it's commenting about historical use, landscaping, tourism, and gardening. And I just really want to make people aware of their environment. And if Carl can put the first images up. 15 years ago, I decided really to move away from more gallery-based installations and paintings, drawings, and prints. And I've always been very curious about the Americans' obsession with lawns. And I had this big lawn outside of my house, and I decided to create a piece. It's called Mow, a natural parterre. It's called Mow because I use a mower to create the work. And I created these 4 sections based on a parterre garden structure. But instead of having the plantings within the 4 structures, I decided just to let plants grow. I was curious about how long it would take before it became a wood, really. So it's about 14 years old now, and unfortunately it's destroyed because when we sold the house, it turns out that the structure is on top of the septic system. So unfortunately it's had to be destroyed. So it does not exist anymore. Another piece you see on the top right there, that's called a leaf parterre. And this is a more temporary structure where I collected all the leaves in the autumn, put them into these squares and just let them sit over winter. In the spring, I then took back the leaves, and of course the grass underneath has been has died. So what I did was document it over the years as it appeared and disappeared through the seasons, and different plants would come in and out of the area. Now it's completely gone. So it's a sort of temporary work of art. And so that's where these things, this sort of, the idea of making installations in the landscape came from. Then I was invited to be an artist in residence at iPark. So Carl, if you could show the iPark photographs. iPark's an interesting place. It's down in East Haddam. And if you're an artist or a writer or a musician, composer, you should apply there because it gives you a month to concentrate on your work without any outside interference. You have your food cooked for you, and you're just left alone to do your work. It's an amazing place, and I suggest if you're an artist, apply to it. But what they did, that they allowed me to work in the meadow there, and I created 3 pieces. The first of which was called Invasive Topiary Parterre, which is the one on the left-hand side. So what I did here was use the same parterre structure, the sort of English garden squares of plantings. But what I did was plant each square with an invasive species. What people don't understand about the landscape that they're looking at now is that 100 years ago, it would have looked completely different. We've introduced these wonderful exotic plants into the landscapes, and they've escaped from the garden, and they're basically taking over the landscape. Autumn olive, multiflora rose, winged euonymus, barberry. So what I did was symbolically encapsulate them in a cage and trim them down with the aid of deer that would come along. So it's a symbolic encapsulation of these invasive species. What I'm trying to do is to educate people that, you know, it's a fun way of looking at how the landscape has changed. I was then invited back a few years later to make a couple of other pieces, including the Hortus Conclusus, the Forbidden Garden. What I did here was use the idea of the medieval garden. The medieval garden was very much a device to control landscape. That's one of the fundamental things about my work, is this looking at how man has tried to control landscape using gardens, and formal gardens especially. But in this particular Hortus Conclusus, or enclosed garden, I thought I'd make a forbidden garden. So I made a structure and encouraged and planted from seed, by the way, because poison ivy is not particularly easy to grow. So this square, this meshed cage, is covered in poison ivy. But in the middle of the square is this beautiful rose. So in order to see the rose, you need to get through the poison ivy. So I love this idea, this sort of Beauty and the Beast idea, which a lot of people have found very interesting, except I have to put signs up saying, beware of the poison ivy. And another project that I've been working on there, this is a long-term project, is a 275-acre parcel of the land there that the director of iPark wants to eventually make into a memoriam, a memory. The idea is that you can put the ashes of your loved ones either as a part of a sculpture in the area, but it's almost like a meditation walk through the landscape that you can remember your loved ones. So so iPark has been a great source for me of being able to experiment and think about the projects that I've been working on. So that moves us to the last 3 years. So Carl, if you could show the Hillstead and 5 Points photographs. On the strength of what I did at iPark, Hillstead Museum in Farmington, it's a beautiful museum with beautiful grounds. And they, now I think that one's, okay. I think you've missed out the Hillstead and 5 Points, Carl. These are the working drawings. Anyway, Hillstead commissioned me to make a new piece that I based, there we go, based on the idea that I had with the Meaux, the natural parterre. Except this piece is about 120 feet long, and it you can view it from the portico of the Colonial Museum, and it's a part of the walking system. And I've again based it on this a grid that is easy to mow. I do the mowing. I go there every 2 or 3 weeks to clear the grounds, and as is a part of the walk, it makes people stop because you're given various directions that you can walk into and out of the piece. So that works. I'm very pleased with this piece, and I'm even more pleased by the involvement. Another part of my work is to get people involved in what is happening, to watch the changing of the various plants, flora and fauna that might go in. So I've been working with students from Miss Porter's school, which is a school just down the road. And they've been coming up regularly to analyze all the plants that are inside the parterre structure and on the grassway. So it becomes like a scientific experiment. My work is, I believe, that it's in between the science and the art. I'm very interested in the dialogue between the two. And the students are great. I mean, we gave them, they came over to see it for a private showing of the exhibition, and they saw I made a book about the experiences that they put into it. And so I've really enjoyed that aspect of working. on that piece. And then last year, I got a grant from the Connecticut Arts, and I approached 5 Points Center for the Arts, Judy, to see if I could make a piece on the campus, on the grounds there. So this is a new piece, and basically it's the same as the Hillstead, except it goes in and out of the woods. So it's a woodland meadow parterre. So I'm very curious about this. We've been cutting pathways into the woods, and the circles come around and into the meadow. So maybe in 10 years' time, 15 years' time, those will be part of the woods. And so I'm very curious to see how it progresses from one to the other. So perhaps we should go to how my approach to the artwork that's in the gallery itself. So Carl, if you could show the pieces that I've been making. Well, no, the Chancery Ring one. Sorry, I'm sorry. If you could go to Chancery Ring. Chancery Ring, 50 years ago, I'm that old. A lot of my landscape work was about the southern England, and I became fascinated with a particular place called Chancery Ring. It's an Iron Age fort on top of a hill with a Roman fort on it, and a friend of mine took me up in an aeroplane, a biplane, to see this site from the air. And you know how these seminal moments in your life happen. It was like a revelation, seeing the landscape of this particular place from the air. And what it made me, it changed the direction of my work. So if you can show, there's one particular slide at the end called, that's the one, yeah. I made a work that used not just the ground view of Chancery Ring, but also the aerial view, the sort of lateral view. And then I realized that maps are basically are graphic representations of landscape. So why not include that? So that started off a whole new way of working. I started using the walk through the landscape as an artwork in itself, and started observations of weather, and as the weather moved over landscape. So that all became a part, it all became my palette, I guess, of how I would approach the works. So going to the works in the exhibition, let me talk about the process. So you'll see in the works in the exhibition, they have this reality of the photograph of the site, but also diagrams about the structure and information. This one here on the left is about Hillstead. So in the background, I use, these are all the plants that, and the flowers and things that you can find on this site. So these, in a way, I use working drawings initially for planning the installations, but these are almost like post pieces. They're important because I want to show people the process or the way that I'm sort of observing these particular installations and how they grow. So they're like ongoing drawings, really. And of course, every year, every 2 or 3 years, they will change. So there'll be more information coming in and out. That's why I think working with the students is basically probably the most important aspect of the work.
All right.
Someone got a question?
So I think that was a really great introduction to your work. It's so multi-layered with the drawings and the installations and the photos of that. So thank you, Bob. So I would like to jump to Jennifer. If you could introduce your work that is in the gallery. I know you have 2 series. Maybe talk a little bit about both, and then where both series originated.
They're abstracted landscapes and my drip paintings. They originated. They were in my head. Everything that abstracts that are up there are all things that I envisioned between that moment of when you're sleeping and when you wake up. Those are all visions that I see. So I sketch them out and just roughly draw them. And then COVID hit and I had all this extra time. So I really got to dive into doing these paintings. And the drips that coordinate with them, that just kind of, I wanted to pull the colors out of the abstracts is what I wanted to do. I wanted to pull the colors out and do a totally different take on the play of colors. Because I'm fascinated by color and how color interacts with, how red can look totally different next to blue or green or yellow or whatever it is. That really fascinates me. And both of, in the creating of all of these paintings, it's very physical, and it's also, it's a lot of, there's so many layers. There's just so many layers to both the oils and to the drips. So they evolve and they change momentarily, pretty much. They'll look totally different at the end of the day, and then back to what they were the next day. That's what I've got for you.
So are they connected, the two series?
They are connected.
Okay.
Yeah, they are connected. The drips were created pretty much, not exclusively like the this particular one you're showing right now. I had a red drip painting that I wanted to pull the colors out and make onto a landscape. And this is my very, very subtle commentary on global warming, because it's called Glacier, so not so subtle, but I'm fascinated by shapes too. I love shapes. You can probably tell that, and how they interact with one another. And
great, thank you. So Susan, going to your work in the lower gallery, can you introduce this installation and describe where the work originated?
Sure. All of my work since 2011 has been about water in the context of climate change. And this piece, in the beginning, there was only water, reframes the biblical creation myth in which man, and man in quotation marks, is granted dominion over all of the earth's plants and animals. And I have created a story that is more non-human centric. It's comprised of 39 paintings. Each of them is 30 inches by 15 inches. The work is hung without any space between the panels, and it measures about 50 feet. So the extended horizontal format of the piece creates a running narrative that begins approximately 3.8 billion years ago, when our fiery planet started to cool and the rains began to fall for centuries, filling up the basins that eventually became the primeval ocean. In the beginning, there was only water is an abstract interpretation of what scientists have determined really happened at the creation of the planet and for the billions of years that followed. And it grew out of my participation in a group of 8 female eco-artists who met virtually on a regular basis during the height of the COVID pandemic. And we originally had assembled to read and discuss a newly published book called All We Can Save: Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis, which was edited by Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson and Catherine Wilkinson. And while I was reading the book, I was struck by a woman named Kendra Pierre-Louis, who in her essay called Wakanda doesn't have suburbs, was calling for new stories to replace the biblical creation myth that cast humans as separate and even superior to nature. And in fact, that point of view has justified, if not condoned, our species' relationship, I should say appetite, to use and abuse the Earth's resources in any way that we choose, without regard to the impact of our actions on non-human beings like rivers and oceans, forests, land, and atmosphere upon which we depend for our own survival. And she goes on to say that this creation myth set human beings on a destructive path that evolved over the millennia into our, and what she, I'm going to quote her here, our innate tendency to destroy the environment ever since Eve took a bite of, and these are her words, that damn apple. And in my new story, the whole world is an Eden, not just a simple garden, and without an apple tree or a human being in sight. So the piece starts, as I said, when the planet was all water, and it ends in water. And I guess I'll stop there.
Thank you. So Bob, I'd like to go back to your work. And I had the fortune to see the piece at the 5 Points Art Center kind of begin, since I was working there over the summer. So can you go into your process with that piece in particular a little bit more, kind of talking us through how it, like how did you come up with this particular garden design, and then how do you see it evolving over time?
Right. Well, as I mentioned before, this is really built on what I did at Hillstead. The main factor was that you could mow it easily without hitting any corners. So I modeled all sorts of designs that will work with this. So the idea of concentric rings that, as you can see in this one, is particularly clear in this. I evolved this pattern where the corners were rounded and that you could basically mow. This piece, actually, I don't mow because the grounds person does it for me, which is great because this particular site is a good hour away from where I live. But it started off very well. We still need to remove some of the trees. We decided actually not to remove the healthy trees, but to remove, there's quite a few trees in there that are damaged and have been attacked by borers. And in the spring, I shall be putting mulch and wood chips into the areas in the woods, so it would be easy to walk through. We're also going to get rid of the poison ivy there, which is very prolific. So I'm letting the grounds person do that. The curious thing about poison ivy, going back to the other piece I made, is that when I first moved to England, from England to America, I could handle poison ivy no problem. It didn't affect me at all. Now I'm incredibly sensitive to it. So I almost have to wear a hazmat suit if I'm working in ipark on that piece, and also here to clear the poison ivy. So and on the left there, you see that's like, I'm fascinated by diagrams and diagrammatic representations of ideas I have. So here you have, if you look at it, how we would ideally grow if everything went vertically, but of course it's not. It's going to form these, it's going to form domes, I think, of different foliage and trees. And of course the interior, what I find interesting is all the beautiful mosses and the ferns that are growing in the wooded areas, which we're going to keep and maintain. So with this piece, I'm also trying to persuade, well, I had a word with Judy, the director, about getting local school kids to come over and do some projects about examining all the different plants that are going to be coming through. Because the lawn in itself perhaps only has about 2 or 3 varieties in it. And you start mowing it and you kill a lot of it. So to let it grow and let birds come in with their seeds, and animals will come in. And what will eventually happen is the grasses will disappear, perennial shrubs will start to appear, and then eventually trees will take over, and the shade of the trees will kill off all the or suppress the other plants. That's what happened with that very first piece. After 15 years before it was destroyed, trees were beginning to take over the whole process. So my only hope is that there's not a septic system under this particular piece, which means that it will be destroyed.
Yes, yes. So there's a question in the chat that I think is related to this piece in particular. What was like your influence behind this? And this question is, was the Stonehenge monument kind of influenced by it? Because it kind of
That's
looks
interesting,
like
actually. I never really thought about that, but yes, it actually looks like a henge, doesn't it, with circles? So perhaps it could become a ritual site in the end, you know? We could do rituals in the middle. But that's interesting how it's, yes, it's all in the eye of the beholder, isn't it, of how you look at things. Yeah,
definitely.
that's an interesting comment.
Okay, so going back to Jennifer now, could you talk more about the relationship to landscape in these pieces that are in the gallery, and describe what the inspiration for the abstract landscapes especially were?
Well, like I said before, they're just kind of images that were in my dream wake state. And I wanted to I like breaking things down to shape, particularly these. So these all started out just very basic colors, just actually total opposite colors, what's probably on there. And I just kept layering and layering. I need a little more specific question. I don't quite.
Was there like a specific place in mind that these pieces kind of remind you of?
The only one that would be specific would be Iceland, which is the first one. Because I was in Iceland a couple of years ago with my sister, and those were kind of the colors that pervade when I was there. It's very, all those colors, not really green. I'll take the green out of that, but just very cold, and I like the color combinations together.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a fan of Iceland, but I'm probably one of the very few people who isn't. It's just if I found this was my representation of how Iceland was to me. Also very angular, a very angular place too.
And then you mentioned previously that some of the pieces relate to climate change. So is that something that you're thinking about with?
No, not really. That's not really, I mean, of course, everybody thinks about it, but I'm not. They just, that was probably something that was was definitely during COVID, during that lockdown. It just probably was a hot topic at the moment, and it was bugging me, and I needed to reflect it somehow.
Yeah, with that piece in particular.
Definitely that piece in particular. There was some hot topic going on, and it was making me nuts that people in particular weren't acknowledging what was really happening.
Great, thank you. So Susan, going back to your work, could you describe your process and the materials that you're using? Because looking at your pieces up close in the gallery, I'm noticing a lot of texture in there. Could you talk a little bit about that? Oh, you're on mute.
The materials that I used are acrylic, oil pigment stick, and other mixed media pieces that you observed, including things like gauze and just built up acrylic and decorative papers and other things that I have around my studio. I would like to say a little bit about the ordering, and I'm wondering, Carl, if you have a installation shot available. Perhaps.
Yeah, I think to see everything as an installation is very important, isn't it? It's somewhere.
Well, I'll continue to talk while he's looking for it, but because there are 39 panels, I worked in groups of 2s, 4s, and 6s when I created the pieces. But once I had completed a grouping, I would look at them and either reorder them, turn them upside down. So I did not want them to be didactic in any way. It's really an abstract interpretation of the creation process. So some of them are upside down from how I contributed to them. Yep, there it is. Some of them I reordered completely, and just because I wanted to maintain the abstract nature of the pieces. Now the textures that you're looking at are from the mixed media materials, including built up gauze and built up acrylic and other kinds of stuff that I have in the studio.
Did you make like working drawings of this, or did it happen more or less spontaneously?
I would make very quick sketches of what I had in mind, as I went from sort of geological periods to plant periods to animal periods, but nothing in great detail.
Right.
And then once you made like a set of 3 or 6, did you say that sometimes you rearranged them or flipped them? Or
yeah, well, if you look at the ones that are the closest to the viewer, the first 6 are black and white, which is representing the period of time really before color. I mean, when it was just rain basically happening. And those pieces are totally reordered from the way in which I actually made them. But they work, because they all have the same kind of elements of line and pattern and dark and light.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so Bob, going back to you. So one thing I was noticing with your work is this idea of the relationship between control and chance. So could you talk about that a little bit and how you kind of deal with that in your work?
Control and chance. I mean, order and chaos, and
Yes.
the theme that runs through the work, but also, I'm a gardener too, and the idea of the garden is something that you're trying to control and to beautify. Of course, you can't. I mean, it's impossible. I've been gardening all my life, and so that's the root of it, in a way. The idea that you think you're in control, but then you're not. And they turn your back, and it's attacking you from behind. And Yes, so there is that. That's the thread that runs through. I'm trying to control something that is uncontrollable, really, and you know, to use what other people have been talking about, what we're doing to our planet, etc., is pretty drastic. In my work, I'm trying to make people aware of the changes in the landscape that we've deliberately done, you know, or accidentally done. In the case of invasive species coming in and changing the relationship. And of course, with the students going up to Hillstead, the teacher there, she's very good at trying to make them aware of climate change, because there are certain plants that love, for instance, poison ivy loves what's happening. There's far more CO2 in the air, and it's apparently poison ivy is thriving, and it's much more virulent than it used to be. So I guess those are like side effects of what I'm looking at. But definitely that control aspect of us trying to control something that is uncontrollable, and trying to relax away from that. That's definitely a part of the work. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you. As a follow-up question, there's a question in the chat. So do you have you considered using native plants versus the non-native invasive plants in your work?
Not in my work, because it's not really about using native plants. I use native plants in my I design gardens as well, and in my own garden. In the new complex that I'm living in now, I'm trying to persuade the landscapers, people in charge of landscape, to use native plants. I'm very interested in taking out, for instance, euonymus, which is the beautiful beauty, the burning bush that is everywhere now. It's absolutely so beautiful, so pretty. It was introduced from, I believe, Japan back in the mid last century, and it's just taking over. So I'd rather replace those with shadbush and other indigenous native plants, which are just as beautiful if they're allowed to grow. Yeah.
Thank you. So Jennifer, going back to your work, one thing that stands out to me is how the drip paintings they appear so controlled. So to me, you have the similar relationship between control and kind of chance, like with the more abstract, like mark making in the landscapes. So could you talk a little bit more about that process?
Sure.
Two different painting styles.
Right. So with the oil paintings, they start out, obviously very angular or very controlled, painting. But then I have to mess it up because nothing's perfect. There's nothing that's perfect. So I just layer it, mess it up, layer it, and dig, and just keep layering and digging. And I like to play with paint when it's wet, when it's semi-wet, when it's dry, and just kind of excavating that out. And
so are these on canvas, or are they on board?
they're on canvas.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's enough paint on there that I'm not breaking through. But I can see how that, it has happened before. But yeah, I just really like to take something as as perfect as a triangle and just really mess it up, because honestly there's nothing that's.
So you probably mentioned, is it oil or acrylic or?
The landscapes are oil, the drips are all acrylic.
Okay.
Yeah. So with the drip paintings, those start out very, very controlled, but the nature of paint, when it hits, even if it's dry paint, it's going to run into itself. So there's a lot of manipulating the canvas, so many layers before eventually, probably 8 layers before eventually channels will form, and that's when I can really refine it and make it look like it is perfectly straight. But if you look, they're not at all, and you'll see little slivers of 7 layers underneath. A sliver of pink is going to show through that I didn't cover up, because I want that depth of.
Right. So how important is temperature in the studio?
It has to stay, it definitely has to stay warmish.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, for the oils as well, because they get really hard. So yeah,
Mm.
that's what I got.
So are you mixing in certain mediums into the acrylics to get
Yes,
that drip
the
effect?
acrylics. Yes, I use pouring medium. So pouring medium doesn't dilute the color at all, and it thins the paint out. So I'm able to mix all the colors. They're all individually mixed. Mix them, shake them up, and then pour it. So it'll run down. It's a patience game. I mean, I've taught it to some people, and you really have to have a tremendous amount of patience, which I do, probably to a
Mhm.
fault. But
Mhm.
yeah,
So
you're
you're kind of letting like gravity take it.
gravity. You're also manipulating the canvas.
Yeah.
It's almost like watching paint dry at some points, because takes a long time. Literally, it takes a long time. If it's a big canvas for it to get to the bottom, I can't, because you can only do one line at a time.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. If it's a huge canvas, yeah.
Great. So Susan, back to your work. Can you kind of take us through the story from start to finish? And I think there was a question in the chat that related to this. So you mentioned that this story starts with water and ends with water. So take us through
Yes.
that.
The first 6 panels are, as I mentioned before, black and white, and they represent the time period billions of years ago when the earth was cooling and it began to rain and rain and rain. And there was nothing but water. And then it begins, a sort of geological period where the earth is forming and the mountains are forming. I've introduced, besides the black and white, 2 colors. It's cobalt blue and a sepia brown, and the black and white continues. And I should say that I made a conscious decision that each panel would carry through at least a few of the colors from the previous panel. And the reason I'm doing that is because I wanted to emphasize the fact that all living beings are connected. I mean, scientists have determined that, we all carry genetic information from other species. And so as the story progresses and I add more colors, they still contains similar colors to the very beginning, the cobalt blue, and the presence of water continues throughout the panels. And so here we have, this is the formation of the mountains. And if we proceed, volcanic activity. Again, we're seeing, additions to mountains and seas. This is a reference to the first cellular structures. So we're seeing shapes that are amorphous. And again, there's the sepia and the blue and the black and white. And again, we're getting into multi-cell organisms, where these squiggly and circular forms are becoming small organisms. This is the introduction to plant life, and actually plant life derived from algae. Algae created plant life. I should mention that I did a lot of research in preparation for this piece. I learned a lot about geological history of the earth and the development of plants and animals. And I was very fascinated, didn't know anything about the evolution of plant life, and was surprised to find out that algae, which is present almost everywhere, was the basis of plant life. These are actually the first plants that existed on Earth. They're called liverwort. You can still find them today. And those are actually the shapes. They look almost like, hand from a sort of the peace symbol of, that we recognize. Okay, the underwater plant life and the beginning of life in tree structures. And here I've introduced, I should say that the first plant life, that ochre color, was the color of the very first plants. In addition to that, the green that you saw from the liverwort. When we get into the trees and the root structures of the trees, we now know there's a lot of research that has been done that trees communicate through their root systems. They warn each other for danger. They feed weaker trees through the root systems. And there's usually a mother tree that sustains all the living trees around it. So this is and again, the reference to water, underwater aquifers are shown in these panels. This is the introduction of of animal life. I was playing around with connections and how, animal forms are similar in many species. And we start out with that snake that got such a bad rap in the Bible, and that sort of morphs into the tail of the monkey and the octopus tentacles, and then the front half of the monkey itself. And this is the end of the story. And again, it ends in water, because water is what we need to sustain us. All living things have to have water, and water is in great danger right now all over the world.
So just as a follow-up, a lot of your previous work relates to water. So can you talk about the connection there, and then how you see this evolving?
Well, a lot of my work, as you say, is focused on water and climate change. This piece, this piece was a response to kind of a call to action, that we needed a new myth. We needed something that would inform people about our total distance from nature. That even in the creation myth, who takes front and center stage? It's human beings, whereas human beings are a tiny, tiny part of the evolution story. You have billions of years of history after that. So I'm continuing to work on the topic of water, and in the context of climate change. Right now, I'm doing a virtual residency with a company that's called Planet Labs, based in San Francisco, and they provide global satellite images to universities, to NASA, to all different research scientists who are looking into things around the world. And I am working particularly on the proliferation of sinkholes that are evolving because of climate change primarily. And specifically, I'm looking around the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea over the past decade has developed 6,000 sinkholes around its circumference. It's shrinking dramatically, and as it shrinks, the pockets of water that existed under the ground are collapsing. And I know, Bob, you were talking about the beauty of destruction. These sinkholes are gorgeous. They're filled with
I remember seeing some photographs of them. Yeah.
Minerals that color them cobalt blue and ochre and lime green, and they're just gorgeous. And so I'm doing a series on that. And I'm also looking into the sinkholes in Siberia, which are developing as the permafrost melts. There are these methane explosions and that are creating these enormous craters.
It's all happening fast too, isn't it? I mean, it's much faster than people are thinking. That's the
Pardon me?
Everything's happening so fast too.
Very fast. I'm working with a geologist at Planet Labs, and she, as a geologist, she has studied the Earth in context, and she says that usually changes in geology happen very, very slowly, but in this case, it's happening extremely rapidly. And she's never seen anything like. She didn't know about this, until I brought it up, and was fascinated by it.
A lot of food for thought, isn't it?
Yes,
Exactly.
definitely. Okay, so we have a few minutes for questions from the audience. So if anyone would like to ask a question for one of the three artists, feel free to type it into the Q&A or into the chat. And I'm just opening the questions here. All right, so there's a few questions for Bob. All right, so what do you envision for the next iPark project?
The Netherlands project, which is this memorial garden, which is that would be a nice project to work on. But the problem is you get funding and stuff. Funding is a big thing with the way that I work. So a lot of these things exist as concepts, unfortunately. But no, it's to be continued. Hopefully that will happen. But
Yeah.
we'll see. I mean, I started work on that 5 years ago, and we're just waiting for the right person to come along with a lot of money.
And then as a follow-up question, how did you decide to use a classic landscape design element, parterre, to express your current work?
Yeah, well, that was a combination, I think, of using the lawnmower that made the pathways to make sure there's no corners that you go into. So that dictated a lot of that. No, I was influenced by the monastic gardens of in the medieval times, and also, I mean, I'm a great fan of Versailles, those sort of unbelievably geometric, almost surreal. I mean, they're not natural at all. I'm fascinated by those as well. So at the moment, I'm keeping it simple. I mean, I don't really want to make it far too complex to mess around with the land. There's enough going on, I think.
Yeah. All right. So I think that is all the questions we have time for. So thank you, everyone, for having this discussion. And Carl, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, thank you, Jess, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Let's see. Let me find my notes. So 5 Points Gallery is open Wednesday through Sunday, 1 to 5, and by appointment. And this exhibition will be up through the end of the year. I urge you to please check out our website, 5pointsarts.org, for many opportunities, such as our various exhibitions, workshops, memberships, and rentals. So thank you everyone for joining us this evening. The talk will be available soon on our website, and everyone have a good night.
Thank you.
Right.